On 7th October, terrorist organization Hamas launched its worst ever terror attack against Israel. Over 3,000 people have died in the war that continues. Nobody is sure of the final outcome of the war, but we need to dissect the war from a larger global lens. Is this war simply between Israel and Hamas? Is this a war between Israel, Iran, Lebanon and Syria, Jordan, Egypt? Or is this a war between China and the US? Who really benefits from a war in the Middle East, which some believe will alter the geopolitics of Middle East for the years to come? As the US stations its warships in the Mediterranean, China's finally started chiming in and its statements are becoming more direct and more aggressive. China has spoken to Saudi Arabia, calling Israel's actions beyond the scope of self-defense. If this is a war between the US and China, what could be China's goal? Could the aim be a possible invasion of Taiwan? As the world's attention moves to the Middle East, it takes our attention away from the Indo-Pacific. Will China act on its plans for Taiwan in the months to come? And if China does so, can a world that's divided between Russia, Ukraine, and now Israel and Hamas, does this world have the ability to react? Is it a coincidence that weeks after the India-Middle East-Europe corridor was announced, there is a war in the Middle East? China certainly wants to control trade in the Middle East through the BRI, and a war now puts any new project on hold. Remember, China already has 10 years ahead of the nations that now want to offer a counter to China's vast Belt and Road Initiative. There is also a battle to control the OIC. China, with its allies Turkey, Qatar and Iran, want to position themselves as the most capable bloc to control the OIC. Unfortunately, a war in the Middle East further gives a release to Russia as it continues its war in Ukraine. So who really benefits from this war in the Middle East? We take this conversation forward with our guests. But joining us on the broadcast right now is Frederick Landau, a former combat team leader in the Intelligence Special Forces in Israel. Mr. Landau, thank you so much for joining us on NewsX. I want to begin by asking you, as far as latest developments go, Israel is now planning the invasion of Gaza. The troops are at the border. How do you see these developments unfolding?
Good evening. Thank you very much for having you back on your show. It's an honor to be here. The plans ahead are, first of all, for Israel, for once and for all, create a solution for the war that we have been having for many years now between us and the terrorist group Hamas. This round of conflict is different from the other rounds because this time we need to decide for our current and future situation, are we able to keep living in the country that we live, in the area that we live? Now, as everybody has learned since Saturday, the 7th of October, Hamas is ISIS. Now, in the past, the US forces and many of its allies took upon themselves the mission to destroy ISIS. In the midst of those battles and of that mission, they destroyed many cities, including Mosul and Raqqa. Now that ISIS is defeated, we can all agree that that was a positive. The negative being that without doubt, many civilians died and many of their lives destroyed. Nobody put a stopwatch on the US forces and their allies while they were annihilating ISIS. For some reason, there's always a stopwatch on Israel. This is not something that is going to finish soon. Israel is going to make sure that for once and for all, the Hamas terrorist organization is wiped out and they are no longer capable of controlling the Gaza Strip, controlling the Palestinian population, which they are hurting at the same time. And of course, we will defend our own citizens who have been bombarded for years and just last week slaughtered in their beds. Don't put a stopwatch on Israel. Hamas is ISIS and we will do the same.
Okay, Mr. Landau, once Israeli forces do enter Gaza, what do you think then the strategy will be? Because like you said, that the plan is to, of course, take out Hamas. But are we looking at then the possibility of a surgical strike-like operation against Hamas? Or do we see now in the future perhaps a complete takeover of Gaza by Israel?
So the current situation is that we have put the terrorist organization under siege. We have called for all of the civilians, all of the non-combatant residents of the Gaza Strip to head south as close as possible to their border with Egypt, and to leave the north and center part of the Gaza Strip empty of anybody who is not identifying as a Hamas terrorist, to allow us to go ahead with this important mission by reducing as much as possible any civil collateral damage. We have not yet entered into the Gaza Strip, and I think we are the only military worldwide that is patiently waiting for the civilians to leave the area that we have warned them is about to become a war zone. Now, we are doing so while at the same time the Hamas terrorists are blocking the civilians from the northern part of the Gaza Strip to head south. More than that, in the south, there is running water. The UN have opened some sort of a camp where there is fuel, food, and water. And just this afternoon, the UN itself, not Israel, the UN came out with a news bulletin saying that Hamas militant came into the UN camp and stole 24,000 gallons of petrol in order to bring it up north for their use. And this is something that the world needs to know. Israel is doing everything that it can in order to not harm civilians, while Hamas is doing everything they can to harm civilians, their own and ours. Now, talking about strategy, Israel has no interest in conquering the Gaza Strip again. We were there up until 2005, and we pulled out. We pulled out without any agreements, and the void that was filled was the Hamas, and we could not stand that any longer.
Okay, Mr. Lando, it of course makes it much more difficult for the Israeli forces, given that news is coming in of how Hamas terrorists are blockading routes for civilians to exit the northern areas, and also taking over certain civilian buildings and keeping the Palestinian population hostage and using them as human shields.
Correct. This is a method that they have been using for decades. Already back in 2002, during the second Intifada, the IDF went into major cities in Judea and Samaria, Nablus and Hebron, and we saw all the time that the Hamas terrorists are walking around with civilians. They shoot rockets from families' kitchens. They store rockets in the basement of hospitals. They use schoolrooms. They use anything possible that can make the life difficult for the Israeli military to attack. Of course it's difficult, and that's why we are calling for everybody who lives in the southern part of Gaza to make their way in the northern part of Gaza to make their way south. And we also call upon Egypt to open the border, and we can possibly make a safe city on the Egyptian side, which can be funded by our allies in the region, with the US, with India, to help all of these people out of Gaza for safekeeping, in order for us to take out this organization, the same way that ISIS was taken out a couple of years ago. We need to look at Hamas the same as we looked at ISIS. It needs to be wiped out.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Lando, for joining us on NewsX to give us that very real perspective coming in directly from Israel on what the current situation is on the ground. I will take a moment to go back to the larger global picture that we were meant to discuss. I have with me Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee, Major General Sudhakarji, Vijay Kranti and Madam Nalapat with us on the broadcast. Ambassador Mukherjee, ma'am, I just want to understand from your perspective. I know we've been talking about the Chinese hand for the past few days, but just going deeper into this entire idea of China being behind this war, what is it really that you feel China will gain out of this war?
Well, I hope China will not gain. I hope Israel will prevail, as our Israeli guest has just explained. But China's intentions are clear. China saw a Middle East peace process by which finally, at long last, Israel would be allowed to live within secure frontiers. It would be able to have trade and normal business with other important Middle Eastern states, most importantly with Saudi Arabia. That there was, as you rightly pointed out, Devika, on the 10th of September here, we had the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which would include the Middle East and Israel and Europe, and which was a direct challenge to the BRI. Therefore, under those circumstances, the Chinese acted and acted fast. They have huge contacts with Turkey, within Lebanon, with the Hezbollah, of course with Iran, and they have been able to mount this counteroffensive, which has two detrimental factors. One, of course, in a way, it may result in forcing the Ukrainians into a peace negotiation with the Russians, because clearly the Western attention is now completely diverted away from Ukraine and towards Israel and helping Israel. But on the other hand, it may take away the focus once again, as the Ukraine-Russia conflict did in the beginning, away from the Indo-Pacific, therefore giving a certain amount of leeway to China on Taiwan. But let's not forget, Devika, since foreign policy is all about core national interests, it also diverts the attention of our Western allies from the situation on the line of control between China and India, diverts attention towards China's malevolent and aggressive intentions towards India, and therefore makes it more challenging for us, not impossible, because our armed forces are capable of doing that, but makes it more challenging for us to take on a resurgent China when the West has its hands full in a very difficult situation in the Middle East. Our Israeli guest has left, otherwise I would have liked to have said that it is not fair to expect Egypt to open up its border and to take in half of the Gaza population, because it's against international law. You are actually forcing evacuation of civilians into another territory from where they will never go back. So you are shifting the Gaza Strip problem from where it is cheek by jowl with Israel onto Egypt. No sovereign state is going to accept that. So that is not feasible. Moreover, when the Americans went into these cities that he mentioned, there were not large numbers of civilian casualties because the civilians had already fled. Here we have a tiny strip of land with 1.2 million people jammed in like a pressure cooker, with terrorists hiding between them. And so if they go in, as surely they will have to take them out, there will be horrific number of civilian deaths, which will set back the peace process on one hand, divert the attention of the West, will increase terrorist attacks on Western targets, and will leave Taiwan isolated and India isolated. So it's a very, very grim picture as far as India's core national security interests are concerned.
Absolutely. Professor Nalapat, if this situation does leave the Indo-Pacific a little bit exposed or devoid of attention that it deserves, do we then need to work even harder to ensure that Taiwan, a country like Taiwan, is not isolated, or that we don't stop having a conversation about the Indo-Pacific altogether?
Look, that conversation is going to continue, Devika, but you will recall that yesterday Sunday Guardian carried a piece about what it was on the front page called the superpower sponsor behind this conflict. And that superpower sponsor basically gave Hamas the kind of confidence it needed to carry out this horrible terror attack on Israel. I mean, Hamas, was very clear that there would be that this terror attack would face retaliation, but they were assured by what in Sunday Guardian yesterday we call the superpower sponsor that don't worry, if you get X number of hostages, then Israel will be more or less semi-paralyzed, and they will lose their morale. The Jewish people will start leaving Israel and going back to the countries where they came from, etc., etc. Now, all this was conveyed to Hamas through conversations between Hamas supporters and this particular superpower sponsor in two locations in the Middle East. All that was basically as a result of information collected from within the Middle East by individuals who are in the know about the situation and about the activities of what Sunday Guardian called the superpower sponsor. Well, now we are talking rather openly about the fact that China has come out in the open. And essentially, they're taking a stand that says, all right, when the terror attack took place, yes, you just absorb it. That's exactly what they're telling India. Let Pakistan attack India multiple times. You don't react. Now they're telling Israel the same thing. Let Hamas attack you, but you don't react. And they've come out in the open about this matter. So I'd like to say that I think, what the Sunday Guardian basically called the superpower sponsor, I think the 3 or 4 statements in serial that have been made by the Chinese side indicate their preference for Hamas very openly. As for Russia, Russia is very anxious to divert the attention of the West from Ukraine. China is anxious to keep more and more fires burning so that, as you correctly said, if they create a problem in the Himalayan frontier or they create a problem over Taiwan, the Western world will be too distracted to offer help or to even strongly react. So it is in the interest, and very importantly, if there's a broader war, for example, involving Iran, etc., you're going to see a massive spike in the price of oil, etc. And the Chinese are on clover because they will get access to cheap Russian oil, and at the same time, large parts of the world will have to suffer the effects of rise in oil prices and rise in commodity prices. So what happened during the Ukraine war will happen during this war if it expands. And that is why, in my opinion, cooler heads in Israel, cooler heads in IDF, cooler heads in the US, and certainly as far as India is concerned, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and External Affairs Minister have been very forthright that this conflict has to be localized between Hamas and the IDF. And if that takes place, I am very, very certain that without very much of damage to the global economy, Hamas will be taken out. And I agree with our Israeli friend on one aspect. One, that Hamas has to be taken out. There is no space for terror and a ceasefire. That's what the Sunday Guardian headline was. Before ceasefire, cease terror. And as Ambassador Mukherjee correctly says, you can't have an uncontrolled flow of people into Egypt, because then what happens? Terrorism against Israel from Gaza morphs into terrorism from Israel from the Sinai, and in other words, from Egypt, where very correctly the Egyptian government is not allowing that. So these are the points I'd like to make. One, it is a war against terror. Hamas has got to be eliminated. Two, this problem cannot be put on the Egyptian shoulders. And what has been said by the Israeli guest, that in the south there is ample protection. But the reality is Hamas is now invading the south and taking away facilities for use. Don't forget, Devika, the entire charter of Hamas talks about the elimination of Israel.
Yes.
And by implication, the elimination of the Jewish community. We cannot allow this to happen in the 21st century. What happened in the first half of the 20th century.
Absolutely. Major Sudhakarji, bringing you into the conversation, sir. If the situation is as what we're discussing, should Taiwan and the rest of the world then be worried about a possible Chinese attack or China acting on its, one phase of its attack on Taiwan in the coming months?
Devika, good evening. Thank you for getting me to your show. Let me make a very quick response to your question. Yes, we should be worried. But at the same time, we should be mindful of the fact that China is not capable of reunifying Taiwan under the present circumstances, at least for next 2 to 3 years. So when I say this, there are very many islands which are along parallel to the east coastline. And these mini islands, way back in 56 and 1956-57, Mao Zedong had tried his best, not once, not twice, 6 to 7 times, to recapture these islands which belong to Taiwan, and it failed. So perhaps in the present reckoning of events, this is my assessment, that China is going far too much trouble inside its country. Its armed forces is virtually raising its hand on many accounts. On accounts of HR policy, on accounts of one-child policy, having transited to three-children policy, on accounts of the leadership held accountable on grounds of corruption, on a submarine which was a nuclear submarine, nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine, which had been tasked to travel undersea towards Taiwan Strait. How did the submarine lose its direction and move towards East China Sea and got sunk and got trapped amidst the chain? And there is it is not a danger of radiation. The radiation has taken place. There are 55 soldiers who have died. China rightfully at the moment, in my opinion, for next 2 to 3 years, its armed forces are not ready. And if it has to go from a silent and peaceful reunification is not possible at all. Taiwan is due for elections round the corner in the month of January. Pro-democracy movement is picking up momentum in Taiwan. Large number of people are actually supporting this particular movement. And also, by and by, we see that Xi Jinping is due to visit in the month of November the leadership in the United States. So all these things put together, if you see, objectively speaking, Devika, China is also mindful of the fact 64% of its complete commercial trade, 64% of volume I'm talking of, it passes through South China Sea and the West Pacific. So what happens if this area goes into a conflict? Then what happens to its maritime trade? And let's not forget about the fact that China's source of income is based on export-oriented economy. So all these things put together, I feel that it is a very calibrated approach by China. And when Russia invaded Ukraine way back in February 2022, it was not that Russia wanted to invade. It was on directions of Xi Jinping that Russia was made to behave like a proxy. It is still a proxy. It invaded Ukraine and the conflict is still ongoing. Ukraine is, of course, a proxy of the Western Bloc. Similarly, now the triggers have been actually set on fire so as to shift the global focus and the geopolitical focus from Central Europe and Indo-Pacific to Middle East for multiple purposes. Because your underlying question, which I feel I must answer is, firstly, what benefit is China getting? China is getting colossal amount of benefit. First and foremost, it's gaining time to prepare its armed forces and prepare it, drill and train the personnel of PLA and PLA Navy so as to reunify Taiwan, if not by peaceful means, by kinetic means, for sure by 2027. This has to be shown to prove his leadership. Number two, by diverting the focus of the global preparation for any kind of contingency, Taiwan is playing as a pivot. You see, unless Taiwan is reunified, the first chain island will continue to remain to box in China and prevent its move outwards to the Pacific. Third point I want to highlight is that its very concept of BRI, into which it has pumped in almost close to $1 trillion, is failing. There are a good number of countries, 49 of them, out of which 26 have virtually abandoned. And 49 countries have raised their hands. And major schemes are underway in the Middle East. $450 billion over a period of 25 years have been already committed to Iran. $65 billion already committed and being utilized in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has opened a refinery in China. So is the case with Jordan. So is the case with Israel. So is the case with, I would say Egypt and all the countries in the Middle East. There's a huge amount of interest. China wants to actually break open, not through Suez Canal. There is another corridor which is touching Iraq, passing through Turkey towards Europe. That particular corridor is being challenged by the India, Middle East, European economic corridor. So likewise, Hamas having attacked or gone in for a terrorist attack, I think the correct exit policy, in my opinion, should be to give, address the root cause. The root cause is that Palestine needs to be given its sovereign status and territorial integrity by having going in for that Article 181 resolution, which was passed in 1948.
Okay.
The Israel and Palestine must actually be driven to a kind of a rightful conclusion at the end of the conflict. Back to you.
Okay, sir. Mr. Vijay Kranti, bringing you into the conversation, keeping aside the fact that, okay, China perhaps is not ready at this point in time to invade Taiwan or to launch any sort of military assault on any of its adversaries in the Indo-Pacific region. What are the larger economic implications or economic gains that China could possibly be looking at? As we mentioned earlier, it could possibly be controlling the OIC. It is, of course, and there's no doubt about the fact that China wants to control trade through the Middle East with the BRI. So, like I said, it's no coincidence that so many global announcements are made. We see in the past few years multiple blocs coming up, speaking out against China, talking about countering China, and then you see a war between Russia and Ukraine, and then you see a war now in the Middle East.
Here it is not only the economic reasons which are instigating China to do what it is doing right now. I see that there is a big political game also going on, and right now, when today the Chinese foreign minister has spoken that there should be peace and there should be discussion. Israel should not go and attack, rather it should come on the discussion table. I think this is exactly what exposes China for its strategy, which it has been using since ages. This is a very time-tested communist strategy, that you first attack the enemy through some terrorist attack, and the moment retaliation comes, then you start talking of peace. You can see it happened in India so many times. In Bastar it happened, in Andhra Pradesh it happened. Whenever those Naxalite Maoist terrorists, they take a big toll of the army, and then the armed forces start taking action, then all the agents of Chinese Communist Party and its friends in India, they start talking of peace and brotherhood, etc. Now China is doing same thing. On first hand, there are good reasons to believe that China instigated Hamas. China helped Hamas to acquire all that firepower and planning power and other equipment, with the help of some other countries, which could be Iran and some other countries. And after the Hamas has given a bleeding nose to Israel, and now Israel is going to hit back, now China wants to show to the world that they believe in peace. They want Israel to come to the negotiation table. And as our friend just now, the first panelist from Israel, I think he made it very clear that Israel is not going to the discussion table with a bleeding nose. A demoralized Israel cannot go for discussion. They are, as we know them, they are first going to pay back to Hamas and its friends, demoralize Hamas to the extent that they are forced to come to the negotiation table, and so that Israel should be dominating in whatever happens after this, whether they have to take a decision on Palestine or not. But right now, I think China is playing a game. China has already played its game. First now we know they instigated Putin to attack Ukraine, and in that process, China has practically made Russia bleed to the extent that Russia will be now only a satellite kind of friend with China. Now China wants that the same game it wants to play in the Middle East, and China now feels threatened with this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, and China is feeling threatened because its BRI is already in trouble, as our friend just now said, and the counter, a parallel system is coming up, so it is in China's interest to sabotage it. So I see that whatever Hamas has done is a part of kind of proxy on behalf of China and other friends like Iran.
Okay.
And Hamas has done it. I'm sure they are going to pay it through their nose. And let us see what Israel is going to do. And in next few days, that will decide the game of China is going to play to be successful or not.
Absolutely. I thank all of our panelists for joining us on the broadcast. I've completely run out of time.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.